Have you ever sat in that heavy silence at a family dinner? Here on Bonds and Stories, we retell those moments honest every day, sometimes controversial. Every story is a mirror. Subscribe, join the conversation, and maybe find a little healing. My name is Clara Whitfield. 31. The child people in our town remembered for two things: perfect report cards and the talent for being overlooked. In the Whitfield house, the air always smelled faintly of sawdust and solvent. Whitfield Builders, my father's construction company, lived in the closets and under the fingernails, and the unspoken rule was that it would someday live under my brother's signature. From the time Mason could balance on 2 feet, Dad hoisted him into hard hats and pickup trucks, pointing at steel frames like he was tracing out a destiny. I was given a different itinerary, piano lessons, posture, and a polite smile that never asked for a seat at the table. Robert Whitfield wasn't cruel. He was a storm front of habit. He believed in handshakes, fixed-rate mortgages, and the confidence that the world made sense if a man built something square and plumb. In that geometry, daughters didn't helm companies. They were thanked at holidays and escorted from job sites for safety. When I was 12, he stood me on the gravel at a strip mall build and pressed an orange earplug into my hand as if it were a party favor. "Too loud out here," he said over the hammer guns. "Go wait in the truck." Mason, 2 years older, got to hold the tape measure. Julia. My mother was the quiet exception. She had a degree in finance tucked into a kitchen drawer under the warranty manuals. At night, when the dishes dried in their rack, she opened the newspaper and laid it flat between us. "Find the earnings column," she would say, tracing her finger across tiny grids of numbers. We played a game where I chose a company and she guessed its story from the balance sheet. "Margins," she'd whisper, "are only boring if you don't know what they mean." The light over our table was yellow and kind, and in that pool of warmth, she never once used the word impossible. By high school, I could read a plan set and a P&L. I also learned the acoustics of dismissal. If I brought an idea to Dad, like introducing recycled aggregate into residential driveways, he'd ruffle my hair and tell me I had an eye for decoration. Leave the specs to the guys, he'd say a benediction in reverse. When as a senior, I drafted a proposal for compact infill homes, affordable, energy-efficient, tight footprints. Modular options, he flipped through my pages while standing as if the work didn't deserve a chair and let them settle on the table like a stack of napkins. "Clara, buyers in Riverton want square footage," he said. "We build what people prove they'll pay for." The summer I turned 18, Mom got sick. She hid it at first behind scarves and jokes, then the words invasive and aggressive arrived like a courier with a grim envelope. The disease ordered our lives, calendars covered in teal gel ink, pill bottles like chess pieces. I fetched ice chips and read to her from business magazines she'd tucked behind the cookbooks. She underlined paragraphs with the same neat hand she used to sign permission slips. "Women run firms now," she told me one afternoon when the shades were half closed and heat wavered on the patio. "If someone hands you a smaller map, draw another." 2 years later, the house went too quiet. Grief changed all 3 of us, but it changed us in dissonance. Dad submerged himself in scheduling software and supplier calls as if efficiency could sand grief to a tolerable shape. Mason discovered late nights and expensive friends. I learned to fold the absence into tasks, laundry, essay, scholarships. I could have stayed. Instead, I bought a one-way bus ticket to Portland the week after graduation with money from a summer of cashier shifts and the modest savings my mother had left in an account that still listed her as J. Whitfield. Dad drove me to the station without comment, the dash rattling to the rhythm of the AC. He lifted my suitcase, closed the trunk, and said, "Text when you land." I didn't say that you don't land on a bus. Portland was damp and easy to love. I worked mornings at a coffee shop, afternoons and classes, nights at a consignment store that smelled like cedar and old wool. After 3 years of learning how a chair is a profit margin and a pallet is a thesis, I took a sublet with terrible wallpaper and opened a one-room studio called Northwest Salvage and Design. I sanded door frames into tables, welded legs onto schoolhouse desktops, reupholstered bus seat vinyl into bar stools people insisted on calling conversation pieces. I thought of Mom each time a ledger balanced, each time a supply line finally shipped on time. The company name wasn't an accident. I could have buried Whitfield with my mother, but I kept it as a nudge to myself, a reminder that reinvention doesn't require permission. Work found me first from couples who wanted a headboard with its own memory, then from restaurants who liked that I could make 12 tables match without looking cloned. By 29, the studio was too crowded. I leased a second space across the river and hired a welder who could pull a clean bead like a seamstress. A year later, we opened a third location in Vancouver. People called it a chain. I called it breathing room. Riverton, in the meantime, thinned into postcards. Holidays were phone calls that sounded like calendar reminders. Dad sent me notes authored by his office manager, Robert, as well. Hope you are too. As if the two of us were neighboring offices and not father and daughter. Mason, when he phoned, was loud and generous with jokes. He bragged about a country club he didn't have time to enjoy, about a client who'd flown him to Phoenix, about a boat he didn't pilot himself. I never knew if the laughter on the other end of the line belonged to him or to the men he wanted to impress. The ring of the phone that changed everything sounded ordinary. It was a Tuesday in April. I'd been sorting fabric swatches for a hotel lobby project, oceans of blues, 3 kinds of gray, when an unlisted number from Eastern Washington chimed. "This is Alan Kerr with Kerr and Lowry," a voice said, dry as legal paper. "I'm sorry to inform you that your father, Robert Whitfield, passed away last night." The words assembled with bureaucratic clarity, detached from mercy. I sat down without looking for a chair. There is a particular arithmetic to loss. You add the date to a calendar. You subtract routines. You divide the world into then and after. "Arrangements will be handled in Riverton," Mr. Kerr continued. "There will be a service on Saturday and a reading of the will on Monday afternoon. I thought you should be notified directly. I heard myself ask practical questions: time, location, whom to contact for keys, because the other questions had no witnesses. Booking the flight felt like forging a signature I no longer recognized. When the plane dropped through a ceiling of cloud, the landscape was all river and fir trees, and a kind of green that Portland never bothered to name. The rental car smelled like lemon and new plastic. I drove the old route by Muscle Memory exit before the bridge up past the water tower, painted to look like an apple you couldn't eat. The Whitfield house stood on the hill like a story I'd tried not to reread. Dad built it when I was 5, and I had grown up believing the house was proof that we would always be sturdy. Up close, sturdiness had frayed into indifference. Paint erased by sun, a gutter pulling away from the fascia, a porch board with a soft give in the middle. The yard, once clipped like a barber's fade, had gone shaggy at the edges. I parked in the driveway and watched the windows, half expecting their angles to evaluate me. The door opened before I knocked. Mason filled the frame, his face swollen slightly the way faces get when they've been living on caffeine and celebration and worry. His hairline had lost an argument with time. He grinned the way boys grin at the start of a dare. "Well, look who the Columbia River washed in," he said. "Thought you were too busy turning trash into treasure to make it." "Hi, Mason," I answered, and the ordinary greeting felt fragile in my mouth. "I'm sorry." He flapped a hand as if waving off a persistent fly. "Dad asked about you last week, you know." He didn't say what Dad had asked. He stepped back without the ceremonial hug. The house smelled like furniture polish and something that had soured in the sink. A woman's voice, Tessa Mason's wife, called from the living room, then appeared at the hall in black silk that didn't belong to any Riverton store. She kissed the air near my cheek. "Clara," she said brightly, "you look very Portland." In the living room, 2 men in suits I didn't recognize were talking in low, windbreaker voices about suppliers. The wood paneling had kept its gloss. The rug had not. On the mantel, the family photos hadn't changed, only the framing, the 3 of us on Mason's first day at Little League, on a job site with a ribbon at a wedding where the bride and groom had drifted out of the town a year later. Dad stood in every picture as if measuring a beam. "I'll need your help gathering a suit," Tessa said briskly, then softened. "I'm sorry. I know this is a lot." "I can manage," I said. It was the Whitfield dialect grief spoken through errands. When the men in suits left and the house quieted, I took the keys and drove down to Whitfield Builders on Mill Street. The parking lot was half empty. The sign out front had a bulb out in the W. Through the glass, I counted computers that should have been upgraded years ago and potted plants that had learned to survive neglect. A help wanted sheet was taped to the door, curling at the corners. On my way back, I stopped at May's Diner, the place where Mom had once bribed me through dentist appointments with peach pie. May herself was still there, older, sharper, kind, in that way that didn't dilute truth. "Clara Whitfield," she said, sliding a mug onto the counter before I asked. "You have his eyes, you know. People say that." I wrapped my hands around the heat. It felt like a small favor the world had decided I could keep. "Your dad came in more the last couple years," she said. "Sat at that corner booth, talked less about bids and more about time." She gestured toward a corkboard behind the register. Tucked under a flyer for a church rummage sale was a newspaper clipping about my second shop opening, edges soft from handling. "He brought that in," May added, as if setting a glass figure on a table. "Read it too." I traced the headline with my eyes not touching the paper. May topped off my coffee and left me there with the peculiar intimacy of being recognized by someone who had watched your life from a town away. I drove back to the house slowly, as if Riverton's streets would argue if I hurried. Evening leaned against the windows when I let myself in. In the hallway, the grandfather clock was still 5 minutes fast, just as Dad preferred. On the foyer table lay a white envelope embossed with a law office's name and a date, Monday 30 p.m. My brother had underlined the time with a pen that blotted at the end of its insistence. I set my bag in the guest room and stood there a long moment looking at the wallpaper my mother had chosen, tiny leaves that climbed the wall in a pattern that made more sense if you stepped back. I did, and the leaves turned into a vine I hadn't noticed as a girl. The room was smaller than memory, but held its shape. I opened the window. The night air smelled like fur and rain, and the wet edge of a new page. The service filled the town's old stone chapel with the kind of silence that doesn't quite settle. People who had once ordered kitchen remodels or ribbon cuttings filed past the pew where I sat offering hand squeezes, as if consolation could be measured in pressure. Mason's eulogy carried the cadence of a project update dates square footage the year Dad landed the Mill Street warehouse. He mentioned integrity twice, and love not at all. Tessa dabbed her eyes with a linen handkerchief that matched her dress. I watched the light crawl across the stained glass until it reached the place where a carpenter saint held a square and plumb line, and I wondered if Dad had liked that window because it agreed with him. After the reception, ham sandwiches, potato salad. Low talk, we drove to the offices of Kerr and Lowry on Maple. The building was the oldest in town that wouldn't fall down of its own accord, 2 stories of red brick with trim that someone still bothered to paint. A brass directory plaque listed dentists and an insurance broker who'd probably insured everyone's teen drivers and first boats. The law firm occupied the 2nd floor. 3 o'clock, Mason said, tapping the envelope on the foyer table like it could chime the hour. We signed in and were shown to a conference room paneled in wood that had darkened to the color of tea left too long on the stove. A long table divided the space the way a river divides a town. Alan Kerr stood when we entered, the same dry presence from the phone call, his suit careful without being new. To his left sat Frank Doyle, Dad's closest friend in the trades, thick hands, thinner hair, and 2 supervisors I recognized from job site Christmas parties. In a chair near the credenza perched Maris, the housekeeper who'd run the Whitfield household like a well-kept ledger for 20 years. Tessa took a seat at Mason's side. The 2 of them presented a polished symmetry I couldn't match in my travel-wrinkled black dress. "Thank you for coming," Kerr said. "I knew your father professionally for over 3 decades, and personally since we were boys. He was concise with words and meticulous with paper. Today, I'll be both." He placed a small digital recorder on the table, pressed a button, and stepped back. After a half-breath of static, Dad's voice came into the room like a door opening to a familiar kitchen. Steady, practical, unadorned. "If you're hearing this, I'm not there. I won't make speeches. I built a company with a hammer and a calculator, and I made mistakes I couldn't fix with either. This will says what I mean." The recording clicked off. The silence that followed belonged to old wood and thin carpet. Kerr cleared his throat. "I'll begin with specific bequests." He worked through them carefully. To Maris, a sum that caused her to cover her mouth and stare at the table. To Frank, as a token of friendship and gratitude, the cabin at Alder Lake where Dad had taught us to skip stones, and where I had learned the hard way that canoes obey only physics. To the foreman with the busted knee, the money to finish his roof. To a local trade school, a check earmarked for apprenticeships. The list seemed to inhale the town. Mason shifted and began drumming with his fingers. "Can we get to the principal assets?" he asked, with a smile meant to look patient. Kerr's eyebrows made the briefest assent. "We're nearly there." He turned the page. To Mason Whitfield, Kerr read my collection of vintage vehicles and a 15% non-controlling equity interest in Whitfield Builders. The table absorbed the words before any of us did. Mason's smile held for a heartbeat longer than his certainty, then faltered. 15. He laughed a sound like a dropped wrench. "You mean 50? 15, Kerr repeated, even and quiet. Non-controlling. "That can't be right," Tessa said too quickly. "Robert always said, Mason, tell him what your father told you." "What my father told me," Mason said, voice rising, "is that I'd run the company. That's what this is. It's always been understood." Kerr didn't glance away. "I can only read what is written." "What about the house?" Mason snapped. "And controlling interest." "Let's stop pretending any of us came for the cabin and the cars." Kerr turned another page. If he felt the room heat, he didn't show it. To Clara Whitfield, he said, "I bequeath the residence at 110 Summit Hill, and all furnishings, my personal effects, and my controlling equity interest in Whitfield Builders, comprising 85% of outstanding shares." The paneled room changed shape. It didn't get larger or smaller. It rearranged itself around the fact of the words. I stared at the legal pads in front of Kerr, trying to translate them back into air. My name, the house, the company each lay there as calmly as a date on a calendar. Mason stood so fast his chair barked against the floor. "This is a joke," he said. "A typo. You'll fix it." "There is nothing to fix," Kerr answered. "The ownership structure is older than this will and fully documented." "What ownership structure?" Tessa demanded. Kerr folded his hands. Whitfield Builders was formed in 1994 in Julia Whitfield's name for reasons of liability and tax planning common to our industry at the time. Robert served as trustee and managing officer. Upon Julia's death, her shares were held in trust until Clara reached the age of majority, whereupon legal title vested in her. Robert continued to manage operations as trustee. The will disposes of his personal effects and his trustee's interest. Maris made a small sound. Frank's mouth shaped a silent huh. One of the supervisors exhaled in a long, slow ribbon. Mason's voice thinned. "You're saying he never owned it, that my mother did?" "That." He looked at me as if I had entered the room with a trick I'd practiced alone. "That she owns it now. She has for years," Kerr said. "The voting shares have been in Clara's name since her 18th birthday. The will clarifies management intent and disposes of the balance of Robert's personal estate." "That's impossible," Mason said. "Dad ran every bid. He signed every check. Everybody knew." "Everyone knew what they could see," Kerr replied. "The documents say what they say. The room isn't where shock lands. It's where it echoes." I kept my hands in my lap to stop them from reaching for the only person who might explain himself. Kerr continued mercifully, as if more paper could build a bridge over the moment. He read the standard residuary language. He noted that any taxes were to be paid out of the estate before distribution. He slid a folder across the table toward me, another thinner toward Mason. "I'm going to contest," Mason said, sitting with a thud. The bravado sounded borrowed. "Mental capacity, undue influence, pick a phrase." Kerr nodded in the manner of men who have seen storms and roofs and know which will hold. "You are free to pursue counsel. The trust instruments for the company predate the will by nearly 3 decades. Your father kept meticulous records. I believe a challenge would be difficult." Tessa recovered her poise first. She turned to me with a smile polished to a sheen. "Clara, this doesn't have to be adversarial. You barely live here. Mason has been the face of Whitfield Builders. Perhaps there's a family arrangement we could—" "A family arrangement," Mason cut in, pointing at the folder in front of me, "is that you sign over control and take a payout, and we pretend this was a misunderstanding brought on by grief." "I'm not agreeing to anything," I said, surprised to hear how calm my voice sounded when my ribcage felt like a dropped bundle of lath. "I'm trying to understand what already exists." Kerr closed the will. "There is one more item." He opened a smaller portfolio and removed a sealed envelope with my name written in my father's sharp square hand. Robert asked that I deliver this privately. The meeting ended not with ceremony, but with the rustle of people reminding themselves how to stand. Frank squeezed my shoulder. Maris hugged me in the hallway with an efficiency that made it easier to accept. The supervisor shook my hand like they were testing a railing useful, not fragile. Tessa touched my arm and told me we'd be in touch. Mason didn't look at me at all. I waited until the elevator doors closed and the building's old cables sang before I opened the envelope. There was a single page inside, written with the economy Dad used on grocery lists and framing diagrams. Clara, I kept a ledger for this family, the way I keep ledgers for jobs. Some lines were neat, some were wrong. Your mother and I registered the company in her name when we started it. She said it would keep you safe. After we lost her, I decided not to tell you until you didn't need telling. That was wrong and I knew it, but I thought distance would harden you where praise would soften. I watched your stores open. I ordered your desks through a broker because pride is a stupid habit. You did what people do when they don't wait for permission. I wanted to say that out loud and never did. I read it again in the elevator's mirror, where my face looked like I'd stepped in from rain. It wasn't an apology, not a full one. It was a set of load-bearing facts and the admission that he designed them without showing me the plans. Back at the house, I let the quiet unroll. The afternoon had spent itself. On the dining table where Mom used to lay out tax folders by color, I spread Kerr's thick binder. Tabs marched down the side, articles trust board, consents financials insurance projects. Inside financials spreadsheets tallied years. I hadn't lived in this house. Revenues had been steady, a reliable graph that made sense to men like my father until the last 3, where the line tilted then sagged. Expenses drifted upward in categories that read like euphemisms. Unallocated administrative executive compensation consulting fees. Notes flagged disputes with suppliers, delays that triggered penalties. Punch lists that grew long enough to require their own meetings. The cash flow statement felt like a room short on oxygen. In executive compensation, I found disbursements above salary labeled advance against profits, then a run of transfers to an account with a bank I didn't recognize, each annotated with a date, and nothing else. The totals made my eyes water the way cold air does. I paged backward to confirm I hadn't misread decimals. I hadn't. There were emails too printed and slipped into plastic sleeves, the way Maris stored recipes she didn't want to lose. The early ones from Dad to Mason sounded like the shop talk I remembered direct correcting durable. As the years progressed, the tone changed to something strained, then curt. In 2 months old Dad wrote, "Pulling you from the Ridgecrest job. We're 20% over and the client has noticed. We'll talk in the morning." Mason's reply was one sentence. "I'm tired of you treating me like an apprentice." In Dad's office, the air still held sawdust citrus oil, a hint of the cologne he wore when a meeting called for it. His desk was as I remembered, square orderly, a pen placed parallel to the blotter. The top drawer held a ring of keys and a slip of paper with alarm codes. The bottom drawer, the one that had always stuck, slid open with a small sigh. Inside lay folders with names written in that same square hand, vendors' inspections contracts, and one labeled Clara. The Clara folder was a museum of a stranger who was me. Articles from local papers about Northwest salvage and design openings, printed interviews, where I'd said the word sustainable so often, it sounded like a prayer, photographs culled from my website, even screenshots of customer reviews with lines under the sentences he'd liked. Taped to the back was a receipt from a design firm I'd never worked with, chairs ordered in batches of 3 and 5 dates that corresponded to the months when the shop's numbers had nudged comfortably forward, and I'd congratulated myself on a new wholesale account. He'd bought from me through intermediaries so I wouldn't see his name in the ledger. On a shelf behind his desk sat a small fireproof box. The key on the ring opened it with the reluctant click of metal remembering its job. Inside were 5 sealed envelopes tied with twine. Each was dated, one for each of the past 5 years. My name again in that carpenter's script. I opened the most recent. "Clara saw the magazine piece about your Vancouver shop. The part where you talked about scrap lumber made me think of the Mill Street remodel when we discovered a joist old enough to outlast a governor. You said something about honoring the work. You weren't quoting me, but I heard it anyway. I should pick up the phone." "I don't like phones." I didn't open the others, not yet. They looked like a stack of unfiled permits, like a promise and an apology collated together. When I returned to the dining room, the windows had gone reflective. I saw myself, and beyond the faint echo of our family, as it had been my mother setting 2 plates. My father measuring the length of a story in sentences, Mason arriving late and sure of his welcome. On the table, Kerr's tabs waited. Under articles and board consents, the signatures told their own story. Julia Whitfield at the start, strong, precise, the kind of hand that stands up in court. Robert Whitfield, trustee, on a run of documents that spanned the years like joists. Clara Whitfield on 2 forms, executed the summer I turned 18, both notarized by A. Kerr in a younger hand. He had prepared me on paper when I'd left with a suitcase and the address of a rented room in Portland. I took the house key from the ring and set it heavy as it was in the center of the table. Its weight felt less like a burden than a fact. The ledger my father had kept had lines I hadn't seen. They were there now. As I stacked the binders closed, a car door thudded outside. Tires on gravel, then the scrape of impatience at the front step. Mason didn't bother with a knock. He came in with the air of a man who still believed door frames should make room for him. "You can't actually think this is how it stands," he said, not bothering with greeting. "It isn't a thought," I said. "It's paper." He glanced at the binders and then at me. The bravado of earlier had cooled to something more bitter. "You don't even live here," he said. "You don't know what it takes to keep subcrews in line to talk a supplier into releasing drywall when everyone else is out to deal with inspectors who like to make a point." "I don't know everything," I said, "but I can read math." "What does that mean?" I slid the executive compensation summary toward him. He didn't touch it, so I took advances, he said, shrugging as if we were discussing a missing box of nails. "Dad knew. We're family. Family doesn't change decimals," I said. He laughed, the same brittle sound from the conference room. "You always were good with numbers," he said. "Mom made sure of it." He looked at me then with something that wasn't anger so much as fatigue. "You think he gave this to you because you earned it? He gave it to you to punish me." "He didn't give it to me," I said, hearing Dad's voice in my own. "He wrote it down." Mason stared at the envelopes I hadn't put away. "What are those?" "Notes," I said. "From Dad." "Do they say he meant this as a joke?" He smirked. "Do they say he planned to fix it?" "They say he saw me," I answered. He flinched like I'd thrown something. For a minute we were children again in the hallway, with the grandfather clock ticking loud, each of us waiting to see who would call the other a name, who would be the first to run. The house's bones held. "If you had any sense," he said at last. "Quieter. You'd sign everything back and take the cabin. You like cabins. You can turn it into a boutique retreat and call it a reinvention." He was giving me a picture he could stand to look at. "I'm not making decisions tonight," I said. "Go home." "I am home," he said, and then as if the words embarrassed him, he turned and left. The door caught and clicked. I stood where I was and listened to the car engine recede. The binders waited. The house breathed. The clock ticked 5 minutes fast, exactly as it always had. I gathered the papers, slid Dad's letter into the folder with my name, and set the keys back on the ring. Upstairs in the room with the vine wallpaper, I turned on the lamp with a ceramic base Mom had bargained for at the church sale because she liked the way light held itself in its curve. I sat on the bed and laid the envelope across my knees, palm rested on the raised script, where my name sat like a mark left by a square on soft wood. The day had lengthened past what it could reasonably hold. It had held anyway. In the morning there would be offices and faces and cards to return. Tonight there was the quiet and the knowledge on paper that had been paper for years. The company's shares lived in my name, whether I wanted them to or not. The house did too. I was startled less by the ownership than by the evidence of my father's gaze, how long it had been fixed toward me, how imperfectly it had reached me. Downstairs, the grandfather clock chimed the hour. It thought was right. I counted, set my watch 5 minutes forward, and let the room come to rest. I woke before the grandfather clock's fast chime and made coffee in a kitchen that still knew where the cream lived. The house held the kind of quiet that resets a room. I was rinsing the mug when my phone lit with an unfamiliar local number. Clara. "It's Tessa." The brightness she wore in public had been ironed out of her voice. "Can you meet me somewhere that isn't the house?" May's opened at 6. She chose a booth that kept her back to the door hair and a plain twist no eyeliner, a sweater that did not belong to any winter gala. She slid a napkin dispenser between us like a small wall. "Mason doesn't know I'm here," she said. "He'd call it disloyal." "I haven't asked anything of you." "I'm not here for you." She stared at her hand's wedding band slightly loose. "I'm here for the company. People in this town built their kitchens and their mortgages around Whitfield paychecks." The waitress set down 2 coffees and let silence stand with us long enough that it felt allowed. Tessa spoke without preamble. Mason has been meeting quietly with Rivergate Development. He told them to hold their renewal until he could offer a better rate. He's also been calling other clients, 3 that I know of, saying he'll launch his own outfit in a month. He doesn't have a month. The napkin caught under my finger. Define doesn't. She swallowed. He owes a lot of money. Not bank money. Names that don't send reminders in the mail. He's been covering gaps with advances from the company and then with credit lines I didn't know existed. When your father cut him off 6 months ago, he went elsewhere. I filed. She hesitated on the word and then shouldered it. I filed for divorce last week. Papers are ready. I took a breath that felt too small. Why tell me? Because he thinks he can plug his holes by stripping Whitfield down to studs and selling the lumber. He'll take clients on price leave, crews unpaid, and when he runs, the reputation stays ruined. She lifted her eyes. Whatever else I am, I'm not going to be the person who watched that happen and said nothing. The waitress refilled our cups. Tessa slid a folded sheet across the formica, a list 3 columns, names of clients I recognized, notes in a tidy, careful hand, status wavering. Call yesterday offer, underbid by 8%. This helps, I said. Tessa nodded once, as if conceding a point in a meeting. You won't get fairness from Mason. You might get compliance if you move faster than he does. She stood. He's angry enough to be careless. On the way out, she stopped. He keeps a separate phone, she added, bottom drawer of his desk at the house. Then she was gone. I called Evelyn Park, the CFO, whose signature appeared on half the documents Kerr's binder contained. She answered like she had been up for hours. If you can be at the office by 8, I said I'd like to meet with you and the division heads. There's client risk I don't want to guess at. When did you last sleep? She asked. Yesterday. That track, she said, and hung up. Mill Street felt different with the keys in my pocket. Whitfield's glass door was cold and stubborn. The alarm code accepted itself on the second try. The office had the smell of early work copier toner, cooled coffee dust not yet troubled by footsteps. I took Dad's chair because it was the seat with the sightlines. The leather had kept the shape of his shoulders. Evelyn arrived with a yellow legal pad and a calculator old enough to have a soul. Hector Ruiz from field operations came next, rein on his jacket shoulders. Lydia Chen from commercial bids, Mark Enright from residential, Janelle Ortiz from client services. People paused in the doorway as if they needed an invitation to enter what had become overnight a different room. I put Tessa's list in the middle of the table. These are warm, I said. I'd like to get to them while the coffee's still hot. Hector whistled softly at a name. If Rivergate walks Cruise Park, that's 3 subs and 2 vendors who get paid late. We won't ask anyone to float us, Evelyn said, already totaling. We triage you can live with, and we cut nothing that creates a new fire. Where's Mason? Lydia asked. Not here, I said. We're not waiting. No one reached for a speech. We divided calls. Janelle drafted language that did not beg and did not bluster continuity, quality, stability. Lydia reran the Rivergate numbers and found 2 places where Mason had promised finish upgrades without price movement. Hector plotted out which superintendents could stand in front of which clients without either blinking. Evelyn built a quick view of cash on handbills due and what could be delayed without penalty. We were not strategizing the future. We were keeping Tuesday from becoming Wednesday's problem. At 9:30, I stepped into the hallway and called Rivergate myself. Martin Hale, their point man, answered on the second ring. I'm not calling to renegotiate, I said. I'm calling to say that we will finish the Alderidge build to spec and on schedule. If you want a lower number, it will come from a different scope and a different company. If you want the work you asked for, you'll get it from us. We've heard there's uncertainty, he said carefully. You've heard there's change, I answered. You can come walk the site this afternoon. You'll see the punch list where it should be, and the crews where they need to stand. He was quiet for a breath, too, he said finally. 2 p.m. After I hung up, Janelle raised her eyebrows. I shrugged. If they were going to bolt, they'd bolt cleaner than that. By noon, we had touched every name on Tessa's list. Some made us work for it. Some sounded relieved that a voice answered with nouns. The receptionist buzzed twice to say reporters had called. We referred them to a single line. Ownership is settled. Operations continue. At 1, I drove to Alder Ridge through rain that stitched the windshield into panes. The site smelled like wet lumber and asphalt, a clean, honest smell that ignores grief. Hector met me at the trailer with a stack of marked-up elevations. "We tightened this," he said, tapping a note sheeting. "Saves time without cheating." Rivergate's Hale turned up in a coat that cost more than one of our compressors. He asked detailed questions, tie-ins, inspection windows, and listened while Hector answered without implying that anyone was doing him a favor. When we walked the second floor, he ran his hand along a run of drywall and nodded once. "I'd like a weekly status note until turnover," he said. "You'll have it," I told him, and meant it. In the evening, I ate soup at the hotel because the house fridge held only mustard and eggs. That's where Mason found me lobby bar lacquered in dark wood and television news bleeding a distant game. He appeared suddenly like weather. "You're making calls," he said by way of hello. "So are you." He leaned on the back of the chair opposite mine, knuckles going white. "You think you can step in and be dad? I think I can read a calendar and a budget." "You think I can't?" I didn't answer. He laughed without mirth. "You always liked the numbers," he said. "Even when you pretended you didn't care." A man in a navy suit stepped into our pause like someone timing a jump rope. "Mr. Whitfield," he asked. He held a thin envelope. "I have documents for you." Mason stared at him, then at Tessa, who had appeared behind the man like a second shadow. Tessa's chin lifted a notch. "You've been served," the man said, not unkindly. The envelope went slack in Mason's hand. His face moved through hurt toward fury and landed on a ledge I couldn't read. He turned to me as if I had organized the sky. "You happy?" he said. I looked at Tessa, who was holding herself still. "This isn't mine to answer." He left without taking the envelope with him. The server placed it carefully on the back of his abandoned chair like it could be forgotten there. Tessa stayed hand-braced on the chair as though the furniture might fall. "I don't want to fight you," she told me. "You aren't." "I am a little," she admitted, and then she went precise as a closing bracket. The next morning began with rain and phone calls, and the bitter coffee that comes from pots left to sit on low heat. Evelyn handled the bank with her measured patience. Lydia kept Rivergate warm without letting them think they could rearrange the menu. Janelle smoothed a client's worry that our crews would change faces mid-pour. Hector texted photographs from sites I couldn't reach fast enough. I called Kerr to ask for a copy of any non-compete language Mason had signed as an officer. "There's enough," Kerr said. "Not perfect. Sufficient." By Thursday, word had threaded itself through job trailers and breakfast downtown. Mason was courting crews and suppliers for his notional company. The story about advances and side accounts began to travel alongside him. Deals require faith. Faith requires quiet. The town had turned the volume up. At noon, Frank Doyle came by, not for a formal purpose, but because he was a man who had put roofs on houses and believed in looking people in the eye. "There's noise out there," he said, nodding toward the window. "I told those who asked that you were your mother's kid. What does that buy me?" I asked. "A week," he said. "You can do a lot with a week if you don't try to do a month." We did what a week allows. We sent out 3 clarification memos and made 6 site visits. Evelyn found 2 modest costs we could cut that no client would see. Hector replaced a superintendent who had learned his job under my father and unlearned most of it since. Lydia recalibrated the bid calendar so we weren't promising 2 mobilizations on the same day. None of it made a headline. That was fine with me. In the evenings, I drove the long way back to Summit Hill, past the water tower, past the hardware store whose front windows still sold every holiday and tinsel past Mays, where the neon coffee cup blinked even when the sun didn't require it. The house accepted me. I slept like people sleep when there is no choice. Friday brought Rivergate's email maintain scope, hold price, proceed per schedule. The win was ordinary in the way that heartbeats are ordinary. By afternoon, 2 of the clients on Tessa's list had replied to Janelle's calls with a sentence I liked: "We'll stay put." Mason kept moving. 2 of his own calls found their way back to us. He'd promised completion dates we both knew were not possible without short-staffing other work, and he'd shaved numbers past the place where lumber has to become thinner or shorter. That kind of math refuses to hold long enough to cash. Saturday, I walked through Dad's office again, not to search, but to orient. I pulled another of the envelopes from the fireproof box and read it standing up. "Clara heard you took a second space. Your photos show the light. You always could see where light would land. R. I returned it to the twine and locked the box. The shape of the letter stayed in my head like a plane you can still hear after it's gone. By Sunday, the phone rang less. Calm has a sound when you've spent days listening for breaks. I allowed myself an hour with the house wiping the polish across the dining table the way Maris had shown me when I was 12. The wood drank it. In the front hall, I tightened the loose screw on the catch of the grandfather clock. The tick pulled itself back into line. Monday began with a human kind of problem, a tile shipment delayed by a truck breakdown 2 counties over. Hector found a workaround that didn't offend the foreman. Evelyn signed 2 checks and held a third, not because we couldn't pay it, but because paying it Wednesday meant no one else had to wait. Janelle sent thank yous after every call, and meant them. When the bank manager dropped by unannounced, Evelyn walked him through our binders like a patient teacher. He left with fewer theories, mid-afternoon. Lydia stepped into my doorway with a look that had more edges than usual. You should know, she said, Mason has been cold calling the Rivergate site superintendent on his personal phone. He's offering bonuses the company won't be able to cover. And she hesitated, then finished it. Someone is telling people we're changing ownership again. We aren't, I said, and felt what a statement of fact can do to a room. Lydia nodded once. Then we'll behave like it. That night, I ate at May's and watched 2 roofers argue collegially about baseball, while a teenager wiped a counter like it was a new skill. May poured me a slice of pie instead of coffee and did not ask questions she couldn't usefully answer. On the corkboard, my clipping had acquired a thumbtack with a plastic head shaped like a star. When I reached the house, an envelope had been slid under the front door. No stamp. My name printed in block letters. Inside were printouts of 2 emails Mason to a Rivergate sub promising an under-the-table premium. Mason to a supplier suggesting they get paid faster if invoices come through my new shop. Neither came from a Whitfield account. Neither came with a name I recognized in the reply line. A sticky note read, "You didn't get this from me. No signature." I set the envelope with the others and wrote the dates in a small notebook, because my hands prefer ink when a thing is slippery. The house exhaled the way houses do when the day finishes. Upstairs, I sat on the side of the bed and did nothing for 5 minutes. It felt like work. In the morning, I returned to Mill Street wearing a coat that didn't mind rain. The receptionist looked up from her desk and relaxed a fraction, the kind of change you only notice if you're watching more than you're speaking. I nodded at her and kept going. Dad's chair had warmed to me or I to it. On the blotter, I line-straightened the pen until it agreed with the edge. The calls began. The day turned. The work with all its stubborn, measurable demands kept itself in view. By midweek, the phones had taught themselves a calmer ring. I was marking up a schedule on Dad's blotter when the receptionist called through voice small. "Clara, Mason's here." He looked thinner and older in the doorway. Jacket damp, a tremor tethering his hands. When the door shut, he didn't sit. He stood with his weight in his heels like a man waiting for a wave. "They came to the house last night," he said. "2 of them." He lifted his shirt enough for me to see the bruise spreading like spilled ink across his ribs. "I told them I'd have half by Friday." His laugh was a cough. "Friday. Are you in danger right now?" "Define danger," he said, and the word tried to be a joke. "I need money, Clara." "You've had money," I said. "You siphoned it from a company with our family's name on the trucks." He nodded, receiving the sentence as if he'd rehearsed it alone. "I don't deserve help. I'm asking anyway." I let the quiet take shape between us. Then I opened the top drawer and set a legal pad on the desk. 3 conditions, I said, and watched him exhale like the numbers were air. First, you sign a binding agreement, relinquishing any present or future claim to control of Whitfield Builders. No suits, no challenges, no backdoors. He stared at the pen. Fine. Second, you enter a structured rehabilitation program for gambling. Not a week at a spa. Real treatment. You complete it. Okay. Third, you work with Evelyn to calculate what you took beyond salary, and you repay it on a schedule. I'll extend a personal loan to cover what you need for Friday. It's not a gift. Interest is standard, not punitive. You default, the agreement stands. He closed his eyes and opened them again. You do that for me. I'm doing it for the company and for the people who rely on it. You're not a project. You're my brother. That's the order. Something in his face unclenched. It wasn't gratitude. It was release, the look of a man who had found the stairs in a dark building. He signed the relinquishment where Kerr had flagged it each stroke steadier than the last. He didn't read the terms twice. Evelyn came in professional and plain-spoken. They sketched numbers that would not crush and would not forgive. I called Kerr to notarize. By noon, the papers were witnessed. By 2, I wired the amount that would keep Mason alive until morning. He left for a facility the next day with a single duffel and a haircut that made him look more like our father than he ever had. At the curb, he put his hand on the car door, and then on the top of it, undecided where to steady himself. "If I do all of it," he said, not meeting my eyes, "is there a place for me here?" "If you do all of it," I answered, "there's a place to start." The company did not wait for him to become someone else. It moved in increments that added up. We turned the conference room into a weekly status table where Hector wrote site names on a whiteboard and Lydia red-circled dates that didn't have any elasticity left. Janelle kept a list of clients who needed calls even when nothing had changed. Sometimes the call itself was the change. Evelyn's spreadsheets regained the shape of a plan. 2 small contracts that Mason had promised away came back after their numbers stalled elsewhere. Rivergate walked Alder Ridge with their own inspector and sent a note with 4 words I printed and taped inside Dad's desk on time to spec. Crews stayed. Vendors who had adjusted their posture when rumors moved through town released orders that made our mornings easier. The parking lot filled in a way that felt like ordinary weather returning. In the lulls between calls, I let my hands learn the building. I replaced the flickering bulbs in the entry, rehung the frame photos so they didn't list to the left, scrubbed at a coffee stain that had lived under the copy machine longer than anyone could remember. It wasn't renovation. It was proof that attention is a form of work. At the house on Summit Hill, the air changed. I opened windows and let the fur-scented weather move through. The formal dining room, once a theater for bids and roast beef, had the right light for children. We cleared it, and with Maris's blessing set up low shelves and mats, and the kind of toys that don't break unless you try. We turned the study at the back into a small library of plan sets and design books where crew leads could meet without shouting over compressors. In my old bedroom, I pulled from the attic a box I hadn't opened since I was 18, a row of small music boxes my mother had collected when I was little, each with a tune I had learned before I learned the notes. I placed them along a window ledge, winder keys turned just enough to hold their silence. Spring refit the town. I took to walking the job sites in the morning, boots in the trunk despite the suit, hard hat over hair I stopped apologizing for. Hector showed me how they'd fixed a sill detail without charging change order time. Lydia stood with me in a gravel lot and redlined a bid packet against a truck hood. At lunch, I ate sandwiches with Martin Ramirez, who had started as a laborer under my father and now ran 2 crews with the elegance of a conductor. He told me about the day Dad had driven him to night classes because his Chevy had died. He told me how Dad had waited in the parking lot with a thermos and never said a word. I carried that story to the next meeting like a level I could set on the edge of a decision. 90 days after the curbside goodbye, Mason came back from rehab with a paper bracelet still around his wrist and a step that had learned to weigh itself. He sat in my office like a visitor. "Evelyn has you in estimating," I said. "You'll learn the math where it starts. No direct client contact, no site authority. If you're late, you'll be docked. If you mess with numbers, you'll be escorted out." He nodded and didn't negotiate. The first week he erased more than he wrote. The second week he caught a takeoff error a junior had missed and brought it to Evelyn without explaining it like a favor. He relapsed, once disappeared on a Wednesday white-faced in my doorway. Thursday morning apology already said. I didn't raise my voice. I outlined the next choice. He made it. Progress moved like weather fronts forward, sideways forward. By late summer, the office had shed its beige. We brought in light paint that didn't dim the hallway's open shelving that didn't pretend to be walnut. I asked a local metalworker to fabricate a sign for the front lobby with the old logo, the words Whitfield Builders in the familiar block, and beneath it, a line I'd written on a napkin at May's and hadn't crossed out. Building on tradition, designing for what lasts. No one made a speech. People took pictures of their dogs in front of it. Inside Dad's fireproof box, 3 envelopes remained. I opened one on a Wednesday that refused to arrange itself. Clara ordered 6 conference tables from that shop you use. The man at the counter thinks I'm buying for a school. He wasn't wrong. R. The sentence sat in me all afternoon and made room for other sentences. At the end of August, I called Kerr and asked him to help set up a small foundation using money I'd been too cautious to spend. We wrote the paperwork in the names Julia and Robert Whitfield because sequence doesn't argue with order. The foundation paid tuition for 2 apprentices who had been riding to sites with older cousins and hoping skill could outrun bills. It set aside a stipend for a woman in her 30s switching from retail to the trades because she was tired of selling things that didn't weigh anything. When the first cohort stood in our lobby to accept envelopes, I saw reflected in the glass the framed photo behind the reception desk. My mother at a picnic table, my father looking off camera like a man calculating weather, and the image arranged itself without asking what it meant. The house settled into its second life. On Thursdays, 2 infants napped in the former dining room while their mothers finished punch lists without watching the clock. In the backyard, Hector built a small demonstration deck out of reclaimed planks that had once been a gym floor. You could still see the outline of a free throw line under one board if the light caught it sideways. On a shelf in the front hall, the music boxes waited. Sometimes when I came in late, I turned one key. A tune unspooled itself into the stairwell familiar and edged with something that didn't require a name. Mason asked to see Dad's office one night after most people had gone. He stood in the doorway as if seeking permission from Wood. "He kept them," he said, noticing the clippings at last. "About you." "He did." Mason reached out but didn't touch. "He never showed me this." "He didn't show me either," I said, and turned the key on a box for the sound it made. He nodded, eyes on the desk. "I'm not good yet," he said. "I'm better." "That's the direction." He left before the clock chimed. I sat down and pulled the final envelope free. "Clara Doctor says slow down." "I'm trying. I don't slow well." If this lands in your hands, something I should have said out loud landed short. The company was always meant to be safe first. So were you. I folded it along the crease it already had and placed it with the others. The office window held the evening like a pane holds a reflection. In it, the room looked whole, fresh paint, old desk, a chair that had learned a second posture. Down the hall, someone laughed. The sound made sense in a building that had relearned its purpose. I locked the fireproof box and switched off the lamp. The pen on the blotter lay parallel to the edge. The clock 5 minutes fast announced the hour it believed in. I let it stand. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. I'll see you next time as we continue exploring more journeys and lessons together.